think it's fair to say we all know by now that critical minerals are, well, critical. They're the building blocks for loads of really important stuff. Smartphones, laptops, missile defence systems. I could go on. China has a near monopoly on the mining and production of several really important ones, and that's a big problem for the United States and other countries. It leaves them exposed to supply risk and geopolitical tension. So what are they doing about it? And what does it mean for you, the end user? Let's try and find out. I'm Carmel Crimmins, and this is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. On this week's show, mineral wealth. Economics is all about how resources get allocated. In a perfect world, which for most economists is a free market economy, the price of something is determined by supply and demand. But when one company or country controls the supply of something, they can dictate the price, creating a lot of instability and risk for anyone trying to compete. That's the current situation for critical minerals. It's leading to a lot of government intervention, particularly in the United States, to secure supply. And my guest today is the perfect person to get us up to speed on what's happening. Ernest Scheyder writes about critical minerals for Reuters and is the author of The War Below, Lithium, Copper and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And he joins us now from Houston. Hey, Ernie.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Carmel.
Can I call you Ernie? I feel
Please.
like Ernest is your writer's name, your formal name.
We've known each other for a long time. Ernie, it is.
So this is obviously not your first rodeo with this podcast, right? We had you on last year to give us like the lowdown on critical minerals and, why they're important. But catch us up. Like, what's the current state of play? Is it still China 1, everyone else 0?
Well, definitely China's in the driver's seat when it comes to the critical metals industry right now. And that's because it realized at the latter part of the 20th century, their shrewd significance and their importance to where the global economy was headed. And so it's really cornered the market on the mining and, most importantly, the processing of these critical minerals. And you see different governments across the globe in Washington and Brussels and Ottawa and elsewhere really trying to invest capital into startup companies and others to help produce more of these critical minerals within their own borders or just within the West in general. But China is still the huge gorilla in the room right now. It produces more than 60 or 70% of the critical minerals considered important by the US Geological Survey and other Western governments right now. And it's used that as leverage in its trade negotiations with Donald Trump amid this big tariff spat that's enveloped the global economy. So yes, very much China is still in control of these industries right now.
So just remind us, like, how did we get here? How did China end up in this position?
Well, during the 20th century, a lot of the world was going gaga for oil, as you'll recall. I mean, there was a lot of armed conflicts around oil. A lot of the economies were based on oil. China does not have a lot of oil. And so it was able to sort of look forward and say, okay, where do we think as a country that the global economy is going? And they could very shrewdly see that if they don't have a lot of oil, they could see this electrified economy coming into shape. And what do you need when you have an electrified economy? You need a lot of building blocks for that. That includes things like copper, rare earths, nickel, cobalt, lithium, etc. And they also realized that as part of their plan to become a manufacturing powerhouse, if they were able to encourage more of those manufacturers to come to the mainland, they could entice them in part with lower cost critical minerals. So by saying to, hey, if you're making a battery, for instance, we'll give you lithium or the type of lithium known as lithium hydroxide for use in your battery without VAT or at a lower cost, then hey, like you would locate your battery facility there. That's part of the reason why China is this global battery hub right now, is because the whole ecosystem, including the financial ecosystem, is there to be inducive to encourage companies to go there. And so China also invested in the people in these industries as well. The average student in the West does not want to study mining right now, but there are thousands and thousands of students in mainland China studying mining, including critical minerals processing. And that obviously has a huge positive impact on their entire supply chain. That skill has atrophied in the United States. And what's so interesting is that the United States actually helped invent the modern rare earths industry and a lot of these modern mineral processing technologies in the years after World War II. But in the latter part of the 20th century, just focused a lot less on. It focused more on things like biofuels or other things related to the oil and gas industry. And so where we are today is that China has the knowledge there, and a lot of these companies are in the West are trying to catch up, and they're having a hard time competing for talent.
And what is China doing? Like how is it leveraging this power?
Well, I mean, I think in short, in trade negotiations, President Trump launched his Liberation Day tariffs last April and really billed it as an opportunity to, in his view, have the U.S. take back some economic areas that it had lost. But China basically was saying, look, we control a lot of these critical minerals. And so we're going to use them as leverage in these negotiations. And for a time, China blocked exports of magnets made from rare earths. And that's extremely important because if you're making an electric vehicle or a cell phone, or more importantly, maybe a fighter jet for the Pentagon or some other device, like you need those magnets. And if you have your largest supplier say we're not going to export them, that obviously has huge ramifications. Ford shut down some production of its automobile lines in the United States last year, due in part to less supply from China of these rare earth magnets. We also know that China blocked exports of certain lithium processing technology. It's blocked exports of germanium, gallium, antimony. Antimony is used to make bullets. So if you're the US Army, you can certainly understand why being shut off from access to antimony is a huge, huge red flag. And so China has been signaling that, hey, like you can try to play hardball with us in these trade negotiations, but we know we have the ultimate trump card to play. That is our control of many of these critical minerals and their production and their processing.
And it worked, didn't it? Because Trump did pull back on some of the most aggressive trade moves against China. Like a kind of a truce was reached.
Yes.
Right.
A truce was reached last October. We're still not exactly sure what was in there. We still are looking for a lot of different indications that there's been full resumption of flows. It's a bit bureaucratic and technical in nature, but basically it seems that China has allowed companies to apply for licenses to get access to some of these rare earths, i.e. export out of the mainland to other customers across the globe. But I think time will tell. And also it further underscores the push by some in Washington to bolster these Western supply chains. And so we have seen Trump officials respond in kind with investments in companies like MP Materials, which owns the only existing U.S. rare earths mine and is actually building a magnet facility in Texas to try to supply companies like Apple and others those rare earth magnets. The U.S. administration has also taken a big investment in Lithium Americas, which is building the largest lithium mine in the United States and will become a big supplier to General Motors. They also, just in late January, announced a big deal, an investment in USA Rare Earth, which is developing a rare earth mine in Texas, as well as building a magnet facility in Oklahoma. So they're trying to seed a lot of these investments that are out there right now, but still, if you are the largest player in the market, you have a lot of control over the price of that critical mineral. And so the long-term implications for these projects in the United States and the West in general will, I think, be determined by where the price of these products go.
I mean, we've seen the US and other countries accuse China of price manipulation as well, right? So you have China producing, like, say, for instance, large quantities of lithium, which pushes the price down, which sort of makes it uneconomical for rival countries to compete.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly what Washington and other governments have been accusing China of doing. And I should say it's actually not just the Trump administration. The Biden administration did this as well. They accused China of basically flooding global markets with cheap lithium, with cheap cobalt, with cheap nickel, and basically doing it to push rivals out of the market. Now, a great example is cobalt. Cobalt is used in EV batteries and in other electronics. The United States only had one cobalt mine. It was in Idaho, and I visited it a few years ago. It didn't really actually make that much cobalt because not long after it opened, only a few weeks actually, it had to shut down because the price of cobalt cratered because Chinese miners in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is the world's largest cobalt producing nation, they vastly increased production, so much so that the price just tanked. And so if you're in the West and you need a certain dollar amount in order to break even, well, then you're obviously not going to operate. These miners in the DRC and elsewhere are getting financial support from the government in Beijing. They also operated just at different standards. This mine in the United States that I was talking about, Carmel, it pays its people much higher wages than miners in the DRC. They have safety standards in the United States that they have to adhere to. And so the pushback from the US industry right now is saying, okay, well, if you want us to operate at these higher standards, and they acknowledge that they need to, well, then the market price needs to reflect that. And right now it's not. It's very, very, very much getting back to that old historical supply supply and demand model that has dictated many products for millennium. But that cobalt mine I was telling you about in Idaho, Carmel, its owner went bankrupt because it just couldn't compete.
And what does China say to accusations that it's manipulating the market?
Yeah, so China says that it respects free markets and that it operates as an independent actor in the markets. And so we should say that I and other colleagues here at Reuters have reached out to the Chinese government, including the embassy in Washington, D.C., and this has been the response that they have made to us. And we were talking a little about this earlier, but I mean, it's important to look at this from the holistic perspective when we think about Beijing's actions in this space. And what's really interesting to me is, Carmel, if we were to have this conversation, say 3 years ago, we would be all talking about the climate change fight. How do we adapt our economy to address climate change? How do we build things like solar panels or wind turbines? How do we use fewer fossil fuels every day? That has completely shifted, and in a very, very fast way in the past, call it 12 to 18 months. And now we talk about national defense and security and AI. And so those are the two things that the critical minerals industry has been really focused on supplying. You hear a lot less about renewable fuels, renewable energy. Now you hear about let's build giant batteries that can be secondary power sources for AI data centers. Let's have enough copper so that the US Department of Defense has enough copper for its fighter jets, for its ships, et cetera, that the Army has enough antimony for bullets. From a talking point perspective, it's completely shifted.
Okay, quiz time. The list of critical minerals is long and it's growing. Last year, the US government added 10 more minerals to its official list, bringing the total number to 60. So which one of these has been recently classified as a critical mineral? Is it A, uranium, B, nickel, or C, magnesium? We'll have the answer for you at the end of the show. Up next, we take a deep dive into what the Trump administration is doing to counter Chinese dominance. So Ernie, what is the Trump administration doing to wean itself off this dependence on Chinese critical minerals?
Well, it's doing a lot. It's invested in some companies and taken equity stakes, which I think is probably the biggest thing.
We even had an announcement today, didn't we, about them taking a 10% stake in an American rare earths company, like as we're recording this podcast.
Yeah, I actually just filed that story just as I was getting on here with you for the podcast recording. That's a company called USA Rare Earth. It's headquartered in Oklahoma. Now it is building or developing a mine in Texas for rare earths. It's also building a magnet facility in Oklahoma that will take rare earths from that mine and from elsewhere, and then it will make the magnets that will be sold for use in high-tech or defense applications. And this is a company, as you said, that will have the U.S. government become basically a 10% shareholder. Now, that is coming on the heels of about 4 or 5 other major investments the past year into critical mineral spaces. And what I find really intriguing and fascinating about this moment, Carmel, is that this has not gotten any pushback from any Republicans or any other what we consider small government conservatives out there. But if you remember back to 2008, 2009, the US government bailed out General Motors and became its largest shareholder. And the pejorative everyone used at the time was, oh, this is government motors. People were saying, the government's got to sell its stake as soon as possible. What business does Washington have running an automaker? You don't hear that now at all. What you do hear is that the critical minerals industry is saying we need some kind of help. We are willing to partner with the US government because we recognize that the landscape that we're in right now, especially with price gyrations, and especially with one large actor influencing that price, we almost need to work with the government.
The Trump administration also wants companies to drill more, right? Both on land and under the sea.
Yes, exactly. So if Trump is facing a lot of pushback to mines on land, now he and his administration are looking to the international sea and to say, hey, we know that roughly 70% of the planet is covered by water. Surely there's critical minerals under that water. But what's really interesting here is that Trump is essentially trying to bypass the United Nations and the International Seabed Authority, which is a UN-linked body, to say that it's not permitting deep sea mining fast enough. So he's going to use a 1980s era US law known as DERSHMA, you can say that 10 times fast, Carmel, to basically give companies international mining permits, which is head-scratching when you think about it. But he has indicated that he's going to move forward here. Now, there are 3 main types of what's called underwater geological deposits that mining companies would like to tap. The First and most famous are polymetallic nodules, which roughly are the size of potatoes and are filled with copper and cobalt, nickel, and manganese. And the largest area containing these nodules is a place called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is south of Hawaii and west of Mexico. That's in international waters. So you would need an international permit to do that. But because the International Seabed Authority has spent years trying to set standards for mining and thus issue permits and hasn't yet, and has blown past its own self-imposed deadlines, Trump is now saying, hey, we need these critical minerals like yesterday. So he might push it forward and give companies international mining permits. Now, that would have a whole host of ramifications that I think are still to be determined. Trump is saying we basically need to go there. Now, he's also looking at U.S. waters, and the U.S. has a lot within its what's called exclusive economic zone, which is 200 miles off of its coasts. But it's that international deposit that's so appealing. And because this global race for critical minerals is intensifying so much, now his administration is looking basically 2,000 miles off the coast and 4,000 meters down.
Wow, and I suppose there's a lot of issues there. One being other countries, because it's in international waters, would have claims on it. But also, I mean, mining, and back in the day when I was based in the Philippines, I used to visit mines. They are, by their very nature, destructive to the environment. Presumably, it's very much the same under the ocean.
Well, the key question with underwater ecology and with underwater mining is, what don't we know, right? So It's the least explored part of the planet. It's part of the planet that's never gotten any sunlight ever in history. So we're not actually sure how would underwater mining operations affect the ecology there. You'd kick up a lot of dust. What would that dust plume or that sediment plume do to life there? What would it mean to produce a lot of sound under there? What would that mean for whales? There has been a lot of studies, and some companies have, and some researchers at universities have made a lot of progress, but I still think there's still a lot of questions. In fact, part of the reason why the International Seabed Authority has taken so long to set mining standards is because it actually hasn't set what are acceptable levels of noise, light, sediment, etc., because there's so much controversy.
Right. I mean, does anyone actually mine deep under the ocean bed right now?
There's no deep sea mining currently right now. There is some mining off of a lot of coasts for things like diamonds or phosphates. Some mines actually from land, if they're near the shore, they'll basically mine from the shore underneath into the small water bays, obviously. But in terms of deep sea mining, no, not currently right now.
Yeah. And so from the oceans kind of back to DC, the Trump administration also has plans for a strategic resilience reserve, right? Talk to us about that.
Yes, I mean, the details are still being fleshed out, but in essence, this would work sort of like the National Petroleum Reserve, which basically stores oil for use in the future. Now, I should say that this is a proposal that's come from the administration as well as members of the U.S. Congress. There was one proposed by New Hampshire Senator Jane Shaheen. Her proposal basically would create a $2.5 billion fund that would go out and buy critical minerals for use by Western countries, and it would buy them specifically from Western miners and processors. And the idea being that it would then sell it to people that use those critical minerals, make a profit, and then use that profit to then reinvest or buy supply from Western miners. The idea that you're helping fund that whole ecosystem. So that's the idea that's out there right now.
If you like this podcast, why not subscribe to the newsletter that accompanies it? Also called Reuters Econ World, it spotlights our best coverage of finance and economics, and it's published straight to your inbox every Thursday. We've put a link to the sign-up in the description to today's episode. In the final part of the show, we talk about what other countries are doing about accessing critical minerals. Trump has given mixed messages on whether critical minerals are part of his designs on Greenland. What's your own view on that?
Well, Greenland does have a lot of critical minerals, including rare earths. Now, he did tell the Davos summit in January that no, he does not want the rare earths. In fact, he went on this long diatribe about how he doesn't think they're rare actually at all, and basically splicing the nomenclature of the term itself. We also did tell Fox that he does want the critical minerals that are there. So yes, his messaging has been all over the map. I mean, we do know that there's a large rare earths mine under development known as Tanbreeze from a company called Critical Metals Corp. Now, we reported it here at Reuters last year that the U.S. Export-Import Bank was basically giving what's called a letter of intent to that company to give up to $120 million to help fund that project. The company also for a time was the target of a potential equity investment by the U.S. government. That project does have several what's called offtake or supply agreements with U.S. processors, U.S.-based processors, as well as a processor in Romania that will supply the European Union. And interestingly, a project in Saudi Arabia that will process rare earths and then send all of that processed material directly to the United States for use in the US tech and defense industries. So the project is heavily tied to supporting US and ally needs for critical minerals. Now, whether or not that project or all critical minerals are completely part of Trump's design on the island, we do know that critical minerals are tied closely to national defense, and the president has been saying that we need the island for national defense. Obviously, the Greenland saga has many more chapters to play out, I would suspect, but critical minerals certainly are part of the broader appeal.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen investor interest return to critical mineral stocks since Trump, renewed his interest in Greenland. I mean, are people kind of rethinking perhaps the idea that, yes, you could potentially get those minerals out of the ground? Because it wasn't the sort of the feeling that it's just too difficult to extract them from under the ice?
Yeah, the geology there definitely obviously is very challenging, as you say. And not only the geology, but then, I mean, just think about it, Carmel. You've got an island where they don't have a history of large scale mining. So you'd either have to have a lot of talent relocate there, or you'd have to have some basic extraction take place and then put all that rock on a barge and then ship it to a place where it can be processed at a refinery into the form that you can use to put into your cell phone or et cetera. And so that would require a large logistics cost right there. And so that's part of the challenge that happens. Now, those things can be overcome. I mean, the mining industry operates in pretty cold climates all the time across the world, but that is part of it. But I think two things are happening. One, as the global appetite for critical minerals continues to increase, you're seeing capital try to invest in new novel processing technologies. And there have been several that said, hey, like we can process this rock from this specific mine we're talking about in Greenland and meet with success. And you've got a diverse number of people saying that. So it's not just one party. You've got several in the United States. You've got Romania and the European Union. You've got a Saudi fund saying this right now. And you've got the US government also saying that they're considering this export-import loan. So I think when you've got that diverse base, that signals that this project, while considered perhaps geologically challenging in the past, that you've got a lot of parties interested in it. Now that's one mine. I think when you look broadly at the critical minerals issue right now, yes, it has been a niche space for a very long time, but it's extremely important. And so the more money that you see invested in this space, I mean, it signals broader confidence. When in the past, when we had maybe one or two or just only a handful of parties invested in the space, you're not diversifying or spreading out any potential risk. But the more people that you have come into the space and the more demand you have for these products, then obviously there's a lot more investor comfort in the sector.
What are other countries up to? Like we saw Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney tout his country's vast reserves of critical minerals in Davos recently.
Yeah. Yeah, so Canada is one of the world's largest mining companies and will continue to be for a very long time. Australia, Brazil, Chile, certainly largest copper producer in the world and a major lithium producer and looking to be a producer of other critical minerals as well. What I find really intriguing about all of this is that there has been a realization by countries across the world that these deposits of critical minerals that they might have within their own borders are chips to play in this new global race, right? So in the past, whereas if you had a critical mineral or anything, oil, natural gas, et cetera, you might export it and sell it. Now you've got a lot of companies saying like, hey, wait a minute, we're not just going to let you come in here and dig a hole in the ground and then take it off to someplace else. We want you to actually process it here, maybe make a battery here, maybe make an electric vehicle here. So countries like Bolivia, which is sitting on one of the world's largest supplies of lithium, are now actually trying to build and develop an entire EV supply chain. Now, whether or not that actually happens, we'll see. But I think it's a realization that, hey, like we know that this 21st century economy requires the building blocks that are within our own borders. And so we're going to use them as diplomatic leverage. I mean, China's doing it right now within the trade spat with Washington. Washington is trying to get its hands on as many critical minerals as possible and as much processing technology as possible. The European Union is responding aggressively to this. Countries in Africa like the DRC, Zambia, et cetera, are realizing that their big production of copper and cobalt and coltan and other things are huge leverages in trade communications and diplomatic discussions, et cetera. So we're really seeing that control of these critical minerals is a huge tool. Indonesia, for instance, world's largest nickel producer, is using that prowess in discussions with Tesla and other large automakers. The era of just going into a place and exporting its raw materials for use in your own economies is shifting.
And we've seen finance ministers from the G7 group of wealthy nations discuss floors for mineral prices, like floor prices. Is that feasible?
Yeah. Well, they did discuss it, but they didn't actually come up with any agreement, Carmel. So I
Right.
should say that this meeting was in
This could
January.
be aspirational, right?
I would say, actually, I use the word directional. Like, yes,
Okay.
directional in nature. They all recognize they have to move in that direction. They just don't realize where they want to end up. So yes, there's a recognition that there has been major influences on global prices of critical minerals by China and other parties. But do you set a minimum price? Do you offer a price floor for all your critical minerals projects? Do you require that if you're going to contract with a host government that you can only sell products that are made with critical minerals produced within your own borders or within ally borders? I mean, these are some of the situations and some of the potential solutions that are being discussed right now, but there's actually no agreement on how it actually work, where it would be implemented. So that's why I say it's directional. Like, yes, they recognize the need to kind of move towards some kind of solution, but there's no idea what that solution could be right now. I mean, to set a minimum price, would that be set across all G7 countries? Would host governments pay the miner within their borders? What if you don't have a miner, but you have a processor within your own borders? Like, how would you participate in that? So I think there's just a lot of thought exercises that still have to happen. And the ministers acknowledge as much after that meeting.
Right. And also for the G7, by and large, that would be buyers clubs, not necessarily producers. Like when I think about OPEC, right?
Yeah.
The oil cartel, they're producers of oil, not the buyers, right? So there's also a kind of an interesting question over how they would even go about setting a minimum price, right? When they're not necessarily the ones producing this stuff, right? And then the kind of the producers are a diffuse bunch of countries, many of them in emerging markets as well, right? Not represented necessarily by the G7.
Yes, exactly. And I do think OPEC is an interesting model for critical minerals discussions, because I think countries like China have definitely taken a page out of the playbook of OPEC and recognized that, controlling the supply and demand of critical minerals can affect the price. I mean, that's obviously what OPEC does. The challenge, I think, for a lot of these G7 countries is to figure out how do you increase your internal supply, recognizing that your global demand is going to constantly increase. And then how do you also balance that out with other supply that's out there right now? So basically, how do you drown out the noise and focus on meeting your own demand? And what would that look like to encourage more domestic production where you can internally or in the deep sea or else, while also encouraging more processing within your borders or within ally nations? And as you say, there's no clear formula yet for how to do that.
Ernie, where does this all leave consumers? Like, are we going to be paying more for our smartphones and our laptops?
Potentially. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to require deep conversations among everyday people to think through where we want to get the building blocks that power our everyday lives. Things like the microphones that we're talking to each other with right now are all built with copper. The cameras that we're looking at right now, have other critical minerals used to make them. I mean, we all use these devices every single day. They're all built with critical minerals. They have to come from somewhere. Teslas don't grow on trees. So I think the more we're willing to talk about where these critical minerals actually come from, how they're produced, are the people paid a living wage? Are the miners given safety and emergency training, et cetera, et cetera? All of that has a cost associated with it. So if we don't want one part of the world to control the production and processing of these critical minerals, well, then we need to have discussions around where we would want them and what standards we would want them extracted. And we've done this in the clothing industry, for instance. For a time, people were shocked to learn about sweatshops in Bangladesh and other parts of Asia. And there was a big outcry against companies that would produce clothes in less than positive conditions and atrocious conditions, bluntly. And so you saw a huge pushback against the clothing industry. But I just don't think, especially in the West, the average person thinks about mining, which to me is fascinating because, everything we touch every single day comes out of a farm or a mine. If we want mining to be done at higher standards, higher safety standards, there's obviously a cost associated with that. And we also know that we're having huge increased demand. And so we're saying implicitly that we want more of these every day, whether we use AI, whether we buy an electric vehicle, whether we buy that next laptop or that television or that Xbox. All of these are built with critical minerals. And so they all have to come from somewhere.
Ernie, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
A big thank you to Ernie for coming back on the pod. You can catch his work on the Reuters app and Reuters.com. And we've put a link to his book in the show notes for this week's episode. Now for that quiz. I asked you to tell me which element was recently added to the US government's list of critical minerals. Was it A, uranium, B, nickel, or C, magnesium? And the answer is A, uranium. But it's a bit of a trick question, because uranium, the key component of nuclear fuel, was classified as a critical mineral until 2022. US Congress had adjusted its definition of critical minerals a few years earlier. But with a big new push for nuclear power, and more than 95% of the United States uranium supply coming from overseas, the Trump administration reclassified the element again last year. This is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. If you want to tell us what you thought of this week's show, just drop us a line in the comments section of your favourite podcast platform. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. This episode was produced by Ethan Plotkin and Eliza Davis-Beard. Sound design, music composition and engineering was by Josh Summer and Sebastian Summer. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our show Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcast.